I think it's delightful that we have a gentleman who has won the Law Society Medal of Canada in 1986 in recognition of outstanding service in accordance with the highest ideals of the legal profession. We also have a man, a Jew, a lawyer, who is in the Canadians' who's who in Canada, who didn't come from Montreal. And who will speak to us this morning. And despite my best intentions, every day I seem to learn something, and I learned a new word today. It's called onomatology. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And that is the subject for his discussion this morning. Can we all rise and welcome, with a big yeshikach, Mr. Fred Catzman.
Thank you, Mr. Horenfeld, for your very generous introduction. Mr. Chairman, worthy Rabbi, and ladies and gentlemen, I know it's superfluous for me, and forgive me my voice, if you will. I just got out of a sick bed, but this is one appointment that I didn't want to miss. It's superfluous for me to tell a group like this that when we read the Torah throughout the year, it's divided into sections so that we have one portion each Saturday, and throughout the year we complete the whole 5 books of the Torah. What is significant, though, I think, is that the second book, which we shall be approaching before very long, is called Exodus in English, but in Hebrew it's Shemot, the names. And that derives from the opening words of Shemot. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came into Egypt with Jacob. And then there is a list of all of those people that arrived. So that names go back a long, long way in our history. But those were given names. What does not have that long a history is the surname. Because for most of us, the surname goes back only a couple of hundred years. There were surnames in history in the Roman Empire and China that were surnamed, but what triggered the adoption of surnames among the Jews of Europe particularly was the Tolerance Edict of Austria-Hungary in 1787, just over 200 years ago. It was promulgated by Emperor Joseph of Austria-Hungary and was supposedly an edict of tolerance to emancipate the Jewish population. And to a certain extent, it did break down the isolation of the Jew in the ghetto and open up areas for the Jew to live. But the purpose was by no means exclusively benevolent, because one of the purposes in establishing the mandatory adoption of surnames was that the government was then able to maintain a tax roll from which to collect money from the Jews throughout the country, and as well a roster of military eligibility for the recruiting of soldiers among the Jews. It was for that reason that the compulsory adoption of surnames was not entirely welcomed by the Jews, and many of them resisted that obligation. Of course, when it came to choosing names, where Jews had a choice to choose, perhaps the most common was the patronym, because Jews in the ghetto, in their religious life, were always called to the Torah, Avraham ben Yitzchak, that is so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, so that it was very common for Jews, when they were required to adopt a surname, to adopt a patronym like Abramson, the son of Abram, or Isaacson, Davidson, Jacobson, etc. And that's not an uncommon feature in surnames, because of course you see it in the English as well, like Johnson, Jackson, Wilson, and so forth. However, what I think is unique and different in the Jewish culture is that you have not only patronyms, such as I have mentioned, or perhaps even names like Kaganovich, which would mean the son of a Kohen, or Rabinovich, the son of a rabbi. You had, in addition, what we call matronyms, that is, names after the mother. Because as you know, the mother always had a unique and beloved place in Jewish life. Eshet Chayil, the mother who would take care of the family while perhaps the father was sitting and studying the Torah all day. She was the one that ran the family, that managed the household. And as a result, it was not uncommon that families should adopt as a surname the name of the mother rather than the father. And it is for that reason that your newly installed president bears the name Rachlin after Rachel, just as you have other surnames like Estrin and Rivkin, names after Jewish mothers. Or sometimes you'll find it in another deviation, like Fagelson, the son of Fagel, and other instances where they adopt the name of the mother. Now, if I were to mention to you a name, I would question whether any one of you would be able to identify Kyriakos Theotokopoulos. But if I said to you that that is the name of El Greco, the Spanish artist, I think it's a name with which you would all be familiar. Now, what is the source of El Greco? El Greco was a Greek who came to Spain and therefore was known as the Greek, El Greco. And that, too, is the source of a goodly number of our surnames. That is, the places from which a person came. You find it also in names of countries like Deutsch, which would mean from Germany, Englander from England, Franzose, Hollander, and you have it in the case of Litvak and Polak. You also have a variety of names that stem from the names of various cities. Our own Rabbi Friedberg has a name of a city in Germany. And our cantor Kowarski has a name of a city in Poland. And you'll find a host of names in the Jewish culture that derive from different cities throughout the world. Krakauer, Wiener from Vienna, Salzburg, and so forth. I can give you a series of 4 names that you would label as uniquely and particularly Jewish. And they are Epstein, Shapiro, Halpern, and Lifshitz. All of those, if I mention them to you, you would say are Jewish names. In fact, all of them are names derived from German cities. Ebstein is a place in Germany. Shapiro is from the city of Speyer in Germany. Halpern is from Heilbronn, a city in Germany. And Lifshitz is from Liebschutz, a city in Germany. All of these you consider as uniquely and indigenously Jewish, but in fact, that's where they derive from. You have a name like Rappaport that comes from Italy, from Porto de Leone. And of course you have the whole series of Spanish names from the Inquisition days, like Cardozo and Spinoza and names of that sort. Now another source of names was the vocational or optional. We all know the character from Fiddler on the Roof who was known as Tevye der Milchiker. He was a dairyman and therefore was known by his occupation. Now, similarly, we have a host of Jewish surnames that describe a person's occupation. And what was the major occupation in in medieval Jewish life was the Schneider, because you didn't have to have too much implement or capital in order to ply your trade. And so you have a whole series of names of occupational designation, like Schneider, which is a tailor, and also the implements of the trade, like Noodleman, needleman, or fingerhood, which is the thimble, or Sherman with the shear. In fact, it's very interesting that the 2 most important characters in the books by Philip Roth were Portnoy, and by Mordecai Richler was Kravitz, and both Portnoy and Kravitz are the words for tailor in Russian and in Polish. You had the painter or the dyer who was known as Farber. And one of the specialists in dyeing was Greenspan. Where did Greenspan get his name? Well, the dyer who specialized in the color green used to import it from Greece when it was known as verdigris, green from Greece. But when some enterprising dyer discovered a cheaper and better source of the chemical from Spain, he imported it from there and became green spawn, green from Spain. You had many names that derived from the product in which a person dealt, like Salzmann and Zuckerman, people that dealt in the various commodities, Wassermann, Weitzmann. You had names that designated a position in the community, like the Schulman would be the man who represented the synagogue in the Kehillah, And of course you had occupational names, which derived, of course, from the Hebrew, like Shochet, although you have Shechtman or Schechter, Malamed, which is a teacher, and Chazan. And those of you who go up to the mountains of New York know Grossinger. Grossinger is a singer, and a gross singer was the first singer in the choir. Now you have a lot of names derived as well from the environment that had nothing to do really with any Jewish background, but you see a host of names that have these components in them. Baum, which is tree, so you have Applebaum and Kirschenbaum and Birnbaum and all the other fruit trees. You have the bergs, which is the mountain, and you have Schönberg, which is the beautiful mountain, and it's very interesting that Schönberg, a very prominent Jew in the United States, took the liberty of translating Schönberg into the French, and he called himself Belmont, which is beautiful mountain, and that's where you get the Belmont Stakes of the famous racing derby. Or you have the Hollywood producer by the name of Schulberg, if you remember. Well, Schulberg is just a translation of the famous English statesman Churchill. And that's how names become adapted. You have the names of flowers like Bluma, Blumenthal, flower of the valley, Blatt, which is a leaf, Greenblatt, Rosenblatt, etc. You have Feld, which is a field, Garten, Stein, which is a stone, and Thal, which is a valley, Stern, which is a star. Like Gluck Stern, Gluck is luck, Stern is star, lucky star. Or Morgenstern, the morning star. Then, of course, you have a whole series of names after the different fruits and vegetables. Apple, of course, you know, pomeranz, the orange, kirsch, the cherry. You have corn and coal, which are vegetables. And then, too, you have the fancier names like gold and silver. And we have a lot of coopers, but coopers have nothing to do with making barrels. Cooper comes from the German Kupfer, which means copper, just as Messing means brass. So if you see a person by the name of Messenger, it doesn't mean that he's a courier. It means that he derived his name from the word for brass. And then you have the fancy names that sometimes people have to pay a premium to the inspector to adopt, and as a result of that you get such beautiful names as Edelstein, which is a precious stone, or Finkelstein, which is a sparkling stone, and of course Diamond and Rubenstein, which is a ruby, and Perlstein, which is a pearl. All of those were fancier names that you had to pay the inspector a few dollars extra to get as a premium. And on the other hand, the Jews that couldn't afford that extra stipend wound up with some very awful names like Schmerz and Stinker and things of that sort. And you can understand that they changed that as swiftly as they could. You also had names that were descriptive of people, like say in size, you'd have Gross and Klein. Gross was the big fella, Klein was the short one. Or you have longer and kurzer. You had different complexions, like dunkelman would be dark complexion, heller would be fair complexion. Or the color of the hair. You'd have gold hair, the gold hair, or you had Rothbart. I don't know how many of you remember the old pharmacist Rothbart, which is Rotbart, red beard. And Kraus, which means curly-headed. You had people named by their character, like Goodman, a good man, Feynman, a fine man, Lieberman, a dear man, and Ehrlich, an honorable man. You had the pious people, like Barbara Frum on television. Frum means pious. Gottlieb is a lover of God. And you see that name in the Italian as well, Amo Dio, which is also a lover of God. These names translate into different languages. You have names that were chosen from birthdays. Like those of you who eat a shopsy will be astonished to know that the name derives from Shopsevitz, which meant a person born on Shabbos. And similarly, Peskovich was a person born on Pesach, and that's where that comes from. Troster comes from the Hebrew word menachem, to console, and that comes from person born on Tisha B'Av. Another very interesting source of names was in the Judengasse in Frankfurt am Main, where there was a row of houses of Jews who had settled for many, many years, and many of whom became quite prominent. In those days, the houses had no street numbers and were designated instead by a shield on the doorpost, very much like the old English inn, you know, the lion and the unicorn and things of that sort, the various pubs with different signs on it, the Pig and Whistle, Lahavdale, and it was there, for example, that the name Rothschild originated, Red Shield. It was a red shield on the house of Rothschild that designated their place of residence. And many of these shields depicted pictures of animals, which gave rise to names like Wolf and Fuchs and Loeb, a lion, Ox and Hirsch, or birds like Taub, Tobe, Gans, a goose, Hahn, a rooster, Adler, an eagle, and Vogel, the generic word for bird. Adler, I'd like to expand upon to indicate that that was a name usually adopted by a Kohen, because in the course of duchning, in the course of giving the priestly prayers, the Kohen would spread out his arms, and like the outspread wings of the eagle, the duchen was depicted by the name Adler, so that many Adlers would be of Kohanic origin. You had pictures of fish like carp and hecht, which is a pike, and wallfish, which is a whale, and usually was adopted by a translation from the Hebrew name of Jonah, who, as you recall, spent a little time resident within a whale. You had pictures as well of music. You had the fiddler, the fifer, and the cymbalist. And finally, you also had a whole series of surnames given to Jews who were reluctant to go along with the mandatory requirement to adopt a Jewish name. The government inspectors gave them a 6-month limit, and when some of them failed to respond, they were all herded into a large hall and divided into sections, and each was given a name: Weiss for white, blue, brown, green, all the colors of the whole chroma system were adapted to these people, and that's why you get the Schwarzes, which are black, and the Rots, which are red, and the Browns, etc. Now, a number of names were adapted from the Hebrew because in some instances, particularly under the Tolerance Edict, they wanted to get the Jews away from their own Hebrew culture and insisted upon names that were not of Hebraic origin, so that many Jews resorted to translation, so that a fellow whose name was Shimshon the strong man, became Starkman, the strong man. Or a fellow whose name was Baruch, which is blessed, became Seligman, German for blessed. Shalom, or Shlomo, became freedman, the word for peace, shalom. And a very interesting name for Yitzchak was Lachman. Now, how did that come about? You remember that when Sarah was giving birth to Isaac, she was well up in years, and one of the comments that she made was that people would laugh at her for giving birth at that late age. And so when her son was born, she named him Yitzchak, which comes from the Hebrew word tzchak, meaning laughter. So that if a person's name was Yitzchak, he would change it to Lachman, or Lachman as we know it. And of course, we know in Israel today there is a considerable change from the Yiddish or German to the Hebrew, so that, for example, a person whose name was Weiss becomes Livni, a person whose name was Silver becomes Kospi, and Eisen Barzilai, and Miller is Kimchi, and so forth. Now, I should tell you perhaps about one more category of names, and that is the acronym, which was a very clever device that Jews used to coin names. And indeed, what interested me in this whole area was my own name, because cats has nothing to do with the feline species. It derives from an acronym of 2 Hebrew letters, Kof Tzaddik, which stands for Kohen Tzedek, the righteous priest. And that's where you get the name Katz. And it reminded me of the funny story I heard the other day about what has 4 legs and runs after cats. And the answer was Mrs. Katz and her lawyer. The name of Schatz, and some of you may remember Schatz in Toronto, comes from Shaliach Tzibur, Shin Tzadik Shaliach Tzibur. Or you have names like Brill, which in German would mean glasses, but has nothing to do with glasses, because it too is an acronym from Ben, Reb, Yehuda, Leib, or Kardish, Chatan, Rab, David, Shimon. Now, to conclude, I wanted to tell you that throughout history, of course, names have changed. First of all, a lot of people came over from the old country with long Russian names that the immigration officers could scarcely spell, and some of them very kindly suggested that if you're going to get along in this country, you'd better change your name, and a lot of names were changed there and then. In fact, I remember the story about the Chinaman whose name was Goldberg, and he was asked how come, and he said he was coming over through immigration, and he was behind a Yidel whose name was Goldberg. The immigration inspector asked, "What's your name?" He says, "Goldberg." Then it was his turn, and the inspector asked him, "What's your name?" He says, "Me same," and he wrote down Goldberg. Kept you much longer than I expected, and I'm going to conclude with this one thought. At one time, I felt very, very strongly against changing names. I know that a lot of my fellows at school did change their name because they felt they'd get along better. I thought it was perhaps to hide Jewish origin, and I resented it. But when I look back at it, I realize now that most of our names were adopted in an atmosphere that was foreign to our culture, Germany, the Slavonic names, and so forth, and I no longer quarrel with the change of the names. And rather, I go along with Shakespeare, who I think put it admirably well in Romeo and Juliet, when he said, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet." Thank you.